My name is Sonny, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer of ABC Florida East Coast. This is episode 25 of the Obvious Podcast.
And my name is Peter Daiga. I'm the President and CEO of Associated Builders and Contractors, Florida East Coast Chapter.
The Obvious Podcast is a production of ABC Florida East Coast. Unless otherwise stated, all content reflects the opinions of the guests and the host, which is us.
And if you like the Obvious Podcast, you can subscribe on all the major podcast platforms such as Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, and Spotify, among others, or watch the audiovisual version on YouTube. You can also follow the Obvious Podcast on Instagram, X, and Truth Social. You can always reach out to us via email at theobvious@abceastflorida.com. Links to all the social media feeds are in this episode's show notes. And if you want to help others find the podcast, please leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice.
How are you, Peter?
I'm terrific.
Welcome to The Obvious. I have been wanting to have this conversation with you for a long time. Recently, I got into
By the way, I mean, people need to know sometimes it's like minutes before, right? The podcast recording starts that we're picking topics.
Yes. So we just decided to do this episode on this subject, and what I really wanted to talk to you about, and it's kind of interesting, right? Because I don't know what you're going to say, you don't know what I'm going to say, and it keeps it fresh and interesting for our listening and our audience that's watching. I got into a debate recently with some friends about the long-term, whether or not there are any long-term benefits to Western colonization. And what the genesis of the conversation was all this talk we've had recently about Greenland and Gaza and Canada being the 51st state, right? And some of the liberals in my grad school, Panama Canal, right? Which is interesting to me because we funded it and built it.
And that's completely different, by the way. There's a treaty there.
There's a treaty.
You don't uphold your end of the treaty. Guess what? You
lose it.
Anyway,
right? But that conversation got us going on: are there long-term benefits that stem from being influenced by Western civilization? And I know it's very fashionable and has been for the last few decades.
That's why when you brought up the subject, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm in, because this has been, you hear about it in trendy leftist circles all the time about, oh God, American imperialism and culturalism and and then even to a wider extent, Western, in the last couple centuries or millennial even. So any event, great topic. We can definitely fill 20 minutes with talking about this. So I think there's even a tie into ABC, right? So we'll talk about that.
We'll get into that too. So I, as you can tell if you're watching, I'm obviously the child of immigrants. My family's from India. We were under British rule.
We're all children of immigrants.
We're all children of immigrants. That's true. They say that unless you're a Native American, but the Native Americans came from somewhere, right? They weren't like native; they immigrated. So, anyway, that's another different. Maybe we'll do it.
Yes, it is.
We'll do an episode on that one day.
Because usually the line you're fed there is, Western civilization brought all this disease and all the things. So what are we to believe? By the way, that
recent article on that? Well, Mr. Producer will drop a link on this in this episode. There was a recent article that Columbus did not bring syphilis to the Americas. Americas already had syphilis, and he took it to Europe.
Yeah. So, and the other thing that I find funny about that whole argument is, are we to believe that, 200 years later, that had the Western civilization not come, that the Indians would just be living peacefully right here on the land with no diseases? I mean, come on, disease in a way was it's a biological truth, that as you march through time, different diseases, come about, I think. And anyway, you get my point about, even that criticism from a Western imperialism or culturalism doesn't hold water. They're all these platitudes that the left is super good.
Have you seen a Disney movie called Black Panther?
I have not.
Okay. So
I've read a lot about it, and that's probably why I didn't go see the movie.
Entertaining, but obviously very strong liberal bent to it. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea is there's this whole secret civilization that's eons ahead of anything else in the world. And I'm paraphrasing, but the reason they're successful is because they were never exploited, and they got to grow and be this super advanced civilization. that was untouched by. I mean, the implication is untouched by the white man, right? Like,
Well, we're going to get into that. Untouched by whatever Western culture, they would be missing out on a few things.
right?
But back to your argument with your
With my friends.
Your friends.
You know, and it was interesting. The person who kind of brought up the issue is a first generation immigrant, and the persons who argued vehemently against this position are second generation immigrants, right? And one of my friends who's Ukrainian, who's the son of a Ukrainian immigrant, was vehemently on this issue and as was I, that if you look at Western civilization, wherever it went, those cultures to this day enjoy a long-term benefit, right? Now, that is not to say it was all peaches and cream and everything was great. There was no injustice. There was no crime. That the terrible things didn't happen.
I don't think the rights ever lets the perfection get in the way. What's that saying? You know, don't let perfection get in the way of, I don't know, the progress. I forget how the saying goes.
Yeah.
I don't think the right's ever done that. It always seems like it's the left that, like, just because we're saying there's value in something doesn't mean we're saying it was perfect.
It was perfect, exactly, right? And now your point now makes me think of communism, right? Because one of the lines I heard from my friend was, did it benefit everyone? And there's nothing in the world that benefits everyone. Nothing, right? Because the way people...
Although there's a pretty strong case, I think, to be made for, you know, not crony capitalism, which I think we're at a strong risk of, but true capitalism really has benefited everyone, even the poorest of the poor, right? You've seen all those studies, all those assessments about, you know, the poorest of the poor in more economically free countries are better off than the poorest of the poor in command economies or structured economies. Anyway,
Right.
So I think there could be a strong case made, you know, where sometimes some things have benefited everybody, maybe not equally, if that's what we mean.
Right, and I think that's what his implication was. And our whole point, like, you know, the few friends who were kind of arguing for the opposite side, the idea that you look in, so the issue of trains came up, right? And I was like, look, my grandmother used to say this all the time, that until the British showed up, the trains never ran on time, if they ran at all, right? Now, that's not to say the Brits were like perfect colonizers, of course, right? Like there was lots of issues and problems and horrible things that happened. But they gave institutions and systems to the world that the world is still benefiting from, right? And to me, this idea that it's all evil and all horrible, and had it never happened, the world would be such a better place. It's fictional.
Sure.
It's a fantasy land. Like it's just not reality. And I think.
But you know what's at the heart of that? And we talked pre-show a few minutes ago about this. What's really at the heart of it is there's something else they're trying to destroy.
Yes.
In my opinion. I mean, because, you know, the truth is Western society, Western culture really was based around, you know, a lot of Christian or Judeo-Christian principles.
The great commandment.
Yeah. And so it's, you know, it's really the fact, it's not that, because it's just a fact, you know, in terms of how different cultures have benefited and so they're really, I think, behind the criticisms. They're all tied to really just wanting to get at. That's why you can't recognize the overall good that was done. You got to talk about the bad because you're really trying to undermine the principles that were behind it all.
Yeah.
You know,
I can tell you some of the greatest hospitals in India today are named after saints.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Sure. And guess who started them? It was started by Christian missionaries. Some of the great
universities,
science,
you know, has science. Yeah, anyway, that's a subject for another show and probably much longer than 20 minutes. But the point we're trying to make is, you know, when you suggested doing this topic, I was like, I love that because it's not that the left isn't for imperialism. They're just for their brand of imperialism.
They're for their brand of imperialism, exactly, right?
You know?
You want to talk about the debacle we saw recently with the U.S. aid?
I mean, USAID is all about American imperialism. And we
left-wing American
left-wing imperialism. Thank you. You know, and of course the left is going crazy over the thought of us not being that engaged in American imperialism.
Right.
So they love their own brand of imperialism. What they don't like is the one where the undercurrent or the underlying values behind it were really Christianity and the expansion in the West.
Right.
And, and unfortunately, whether you like it or not, the fact that Christianity founded our hospitals, our orphanages, our idea of charity, our ideas of free speech, our ideas of equity, even, in terms between the sexes. I mean, anyway, we're getting a little far afield of, but the connection we said earlier to ABC is, ABC was founded on the idea of the merit shop.
Exactly.
Which is, there's merit. There could be nothing closer to, I think, the imperialism that the left despises so much.
Yeah.
One of the values.
I do want to. I just looked up the list of. This was published recently of the U.S. aid money. And we were talking about Western left-wing imperialism being sent all over the world. They gave $47,000 for a trans opera in the country of Colombia.
Yeah, Colombia's just begging for trans operas.
Exactly. $32,000 for a trans comic book in Peru. $70,000 for a production of a DEI musical in Ireland. Are they upset because there's too many Irish people in Ireland?
Right. It's American imperialism.
Right.
American leftist imperialism.
$1.5 million to advance DEI in Serbia. Like, again, this is sort of.
I don't see them advancing any churches or Christianity or anything like that. This isn't right-wing imperialism we're talking about here.
This is left-wing imperialism. Yeah. And I think.
And I've loved, again, I loved when you brought up doing this topic because on my Facebook, I'm all the time when I come across a story of left-wing imperialism, I'm always starting sharing the story with, when is American imperialism okay to the left?
Right.
And then, I'm sharing the story of, I don't know, our government or Bill Gates threatening to withhold funding if they don't distribute condoms in this Central African country or whatever. I mean, it's, or abortion, expanding abortion rights in Central and South American countries that, well, pretty much most of the world has more restrictive.
Ireland is very pro-life, and I think
the government did the same thing there, So,
exactly.
In any event, imperialism's alive and well. I think on the left, I think what you and I and most of right of center Americans are for is American imperialism when it comes to our values of meritocracy and hard work, getting ahead, of charity towards your neighbors, right? And anyway, there's a lot of more traditional American or Western imperialism that we could get behind, but.
What drives me batty, and as a parent, I really wanted my children to understand perspective, right? What drives me batty is like this Thanksgiving is an evil holiday, or Columbus was an evil man. It's like there's a ton of nuance, there's a ton of texture to all of these things and decisions and the reasons they happen and why people do what they do. And first of all, it drives me insane that the left will take 2025 values, put them into 1970 and be like, how dare he, right? And their solution to that is to tear down statues and to rename schools, right? Like, how dare we honor somebody who had slaves at a time when everybody had slaves?
Right.
Like, that's insane to me. But like, I wanted my kids to understand, and I want our audience to understand that there's really rarely large swaths of movements that are all good or all bad, right? Like even USA, like we talk about the horrible, dumb stuff that they fund, but they do fund medicines and surgeries and hospitals, and good things happen. Unfortunately, that's not most of their spending, and that's not what their focus is. Their focus is on cultural left-wing imperialism being taken off into the rest of the world that doesn't want it. I know for a fact. I've heard Catholic priests from Rwanda talk about how horrible this American spending is that Biden is making them do or doing in their country, and the cultural change they're trying to bring about, right, in those nations on cultural issues. And you see this, and so it's not like USAID is the worst thing that ever happened and they've done nothing good. Same thing with colonialism, the same thing with Western civilization. This idea that Western civilization is toxic and has done no good in the world is a joke. And it's the biggest joke to people that have lived in countries and cultures without any impact of Western civilization. They understand that because, we come from There are parts of India that still haven't figured out how to have a sewage system. There are parts of India that still haven't figured out how to get clean water, right? And for us to come into this country and to live in this society where we don't think twice about how sewers work, we don't think twice about where the clean water comes from, right? Flint excluded. It's an insane change. So for us to hear, oh well, the Western civilization has done nothing for the world, drives me absolutely insane, because it's like, well, the whole world has benefited from this, right? And so much of Africa and Asia, where you see governments who do nothing for their people, governments that exist just to take care of themselves and their friends, not even crony capitalism, crony governance, right? You realize that it's the people that suffer, but the people who live in this country, especially in the left, don't ever want to acknowledge that. To them, everything that's wrong in the rest of the world is our fault.
Right. And for me, I've asked, as I hope all of us would, as thinking adults and humans, why is that? Why do they not want to acknowledge that? And again, that's where I get to.
That's a great question.
That's where I get to, because really what's at the heart of their criticism is trying to undermine something much more important, much more.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that's what's
spiritual.
Spiritual. I think that's what's really at the fact that
really
can't we come together?
Yeah.
I mean, why does the left have to universally criticize this idiotic programs and spending that USA? Let's coalesce behind the good that we all can agree on, right? As opposed to this
I can tell
cultural imperialism,
right? Nobody would disagree with U.S. aid going to hospitals,
right,
or buying food for people in a famine. Nobody's going to disagree with that.
Yeah, let's get behind that, But no, we got to somehow, make a stand against these crazy cultural imperialism.
I'll tell you a quick story. Years ago, and this is late 90s, I had a friend who was an aid worker in Kenya. And she was telling me there was a part of Kenya that there was a famine going on. It wasn't the whole country, but it was like a small section of it. And of course, with any disaster, the Americans are the first ones to show up. So there was a few warehouses packed with grain that we had sent over. And I'm telling you a story this is from the late 90s. And somebody who fancied himself as a local leader, a Kenyan, in that area, basically told all the residents, well, this is genetically modified grain, don't eat it.
Wow.
Right? So these are starving people.
Right.
And they chose to not touch the grain. Now, I don't know the whole picture or why, whatever his motivation was, but my friend, who was an aid worker, was stunned.
Yeah.
Right? Because this is the grain we eat.
Yeah. And who knows, maybe it was genetically modified, but if you're starving,
right? And it rotted in those warehouses. There were 2 warehouses, I remember she told me, and the grain just rotted. And I never forgot that story, because it's like, and I think this is the biggest flaw with sort of intellectual capitalism. We always assume people will do everything they can that's in their best interest, but they don't.
Right? That's pretty powerful.
And that, I think, always puts a kink in the market sort of working itself out. Yeah. And that's always a challenge. And I think you have to sort of accommodate that challenge. But anyway, that's another episode.
Yeah, how did your debate with your friends wind up? Or is it ongoing?
It's ongoing. I've threatened to call Tom Homan a few times in the debate. I was like, if you don't agree with my position, I'm going to call Tom Homan on you. But it's still ongoing. And there's a growing recognition that a lot of at the end of the day, what is the main purpose of all of this? If the main purpose of all of this isn't to raise the standard of living for most people, what really is the point? Right.
Absolutely. The standard of living, the quality of life.
Quality of life, right? Allowing people to have countries where they can feed their families, they can have a roof over their head, they aren't victims of crime, and they aren't victims of war, and they aren't invaded, right? And if that's not and they get good health care, and they get, if that's not the point,
right?
What's the point of all this?
Right. And I think that kind of was the crux of this past election in a lot of ways for a lot of Americans. It was like they sensed the values that built the country were slipping away. And this isn't the negative, the bad, how you can always take any point in history or time or people and find bad actors and bad players.
Absolutely.
But the qualities that built Western civilization in large part, the things we saw slipping away. The left did not have a monopoly on claiming that democracy was under assault. Most of us on the right felt like democracy was under assault. Having government, undermine free speech.
They killed free speech.
Is not pro-democracy.
Right.
Having bureaucrats run wild with spending or unauthorized activities is not democracy. We're not a country run by bureaucrats.
Right.
We're a country run by elected officials. Elected officials can put people in charge of administering their policy, but not the bureaucrats who never got elected by anybody and are hired and paid to do a job. Anyway, the point is, I think this whole election for a lot of us was evolved around
and how many
those
times,
principles. And
how many times have you and I heard bureaucrats say, he's an elected official, he'll come, he'll go, but I'll still be here.
That's right.
Right?
That's true danger. And
That's true danger. And for this administration and for this president and for Doge to really go after those people and that thinking, I think that's refreshing. Because certainly George Bush never did it, father or son. They didn't fight that. They just accepted it. In fact, the son made it even bigger. Started the Department of Homeland Security, right? Created a bigger democracy.
Sonny, so not bad for a couple minutes before we started recording to decide we wanted to
conversation.
kind of talk about
enjoyed
this.
it.
So thank you for listening and honoring us with your time. We look forward to sharing another episode with you very soon.
For comments, send us an email at theobvious@abceastflorida.com. Thank you for joining us.
All right, ciao.